Hello and welcome to my presentation on Quintorius Loremaster, and why I think he's one of the best commander options in the Boros colors. Now Quintorius might be the commander of the deck, but really the deck's built around this value engine called Sunforger, so this is actually a deck tech on how to maximize the value of one of my favorite cards in Magic the Gathering. Let's quickly review Sunforger. It's a 3-drop equipment that can give +4/+0 to a creature after you pay 3 to equip it, but more importantly, when it's attached to a creature, you can pay it red and a white to detach it and search your library for any red or white instant with mana value 4 or less and cast it. So long story short, you can use it to cast any instant in your deck. I was first introduced to Sunforger when I was building a Firesong and Sunspeaker back in 2019. This was an attempt to be a Magic hipster and not only build a Boros deck, but a spellslinging Boros deck. I settled on casting cards like Earthquake to gain a bunch of life, which would give me more time to find an actual win con, which usually just ended up being a larger Earthquake after I generated a bunch more mana. And part of that was using Sunforger to tutor for answers to what my opponents were doing. And the deck worked pretty well by 2019 Boros expectations at the time, but I felt that the Sunforger stuff was a bit lackluster. The biggest issues I had with it were that I didn't have any way to guarantee I had it in hand. The fact that it was an artifact and the fact that I had to equip it at sorcery speed meant that it was pretty easy to interact with for my opponents, and by the time I actually did get it online, the amount of mana that I had to spend usually meant that I wasn't going to use it unless I absolutely had to, because in order to set the thing back up again, I was spending most of my mana to, set the Sunforger system up again. And once I was done with all that, I'd run out of cards to keep Sunforgering for, so it would just kind of become a dead draw after a little bit. So ultimately, I ended up taking the card out of my deck, but it sat in the back of my mind as something I wanted to try and figure out how to make work better in the future. Fast forward to the end of 2023, and I was looking to revisit the idea of using Sunforger in a deck. So I started looking around at what's been printed since the last time I was using Sunforger, and I saw that there were a bunch of brand new commander options for this type of deck, and we'll talk through those. So the first one's Feather. Feather can recycle the cards that you're casting, and it allows you to cheat your equip costs. And the main way it does this is by using cards like Magnetic Theft to be able to tutor for Magnetic Theft, attach it to Feather, and then get the Magnetic Theft back to hand. My only issue with this is that it really limits the amount of stuff that you can use with Feather that also gets recycled back to your hand. So I wanted to keep looking at some other options here. The next one is Kellen, the Fey-Blooded. He guarantees that you have Sunforger in hand, but that's really about it. He is also a body that can be attached to, but that's all he kind of offers. The second one is Sir Gwen, the Hero of Ashvale. She allows you to cheat your equip costs. She can draw cards if she's equipped in attacks, or if any of your other knight attack. And she increases your card pool too, because she also offers up being able to use black instants and sorceries as well, as long as they share red or white color. But she's a little bit more aggro focused than what I wanted to do. I really wanted to use Sunforger as more of like a way to control the board, so I could do something big and dumb later on. And then finally, we have Arden, the Intrepid Archaeologist. Now Arden can cheat the equip cost once per turn, and he even has partners, so you can expand the number of colors you have access to as well, outside of just red and white. But I really didn't like that none of the partner options really offered anything that I was actually trying to achieve, and they were all just kind of there just to fill colors out, and I felt like there's got to be a better option here. So unfortunately, I didn't really like any of these options, but then I saw Quintorius. Alright, so let's review Quintorius Loremaster here. For 3 generic, a red and a white, you get a 3/5 of Vigilance that at the beginning of your end step allows you to exile a non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard and make a 3/2 spirit. Then you can tap him, sacrifice a spirit, pay 1 generic, a red and a white, and you can cast one of the cards that he's exiled for free until the end of the turn. And if that spell will go to your graveyard and instead goes on the bottom of your library. And that does follow timing restrictions, so you can't cast sorceries on other people's turns. So what I like about him is that he cares about non-creature spells in your graveyard, so he offers us a lot more to do than just simply Sunforger stuff. He makes a lot of spirits, which can be used for making chump blockers, or if we get to the late game and we have a bunch of spirits lying around, we can use them to get in for damage. He allows us to cheat on spells, because we don't have to pay the cost. If we're casting things that cost 4 more mana, we're saving mana that way. And the spells that we cast with Quintorius get put back in the bottom of our library, so we're able to recycle these cards over and over again. So why do I think that Quintorius fits the Sunforger idea better than the other commanders that we've talked about? Well, I think it's ultimately that he's able to recycle the stuff that you cast, so you can get back Sunforger if it happens to get destroyed. And he also can recycle the cards that you've cast with Sunforger, so that you can keep using them over and over again, cutting down the number of cards that you have to have with Sunforger in the deck to keep Sunforger at its absolute prime. And because of the fact that it allows you to loop these cards back into your library, we can create some very interesting combos with Quintorius that we'll talk about in a little bit here. This first combo is actually what inspired me to build this deck in the first place. I was gifted a copy of Thieves Auction and told to find a way to win with this old weird card, and so I did. The basic premise is as follows. First, you're going to use Quintorius to exile Thieves Auction, then on a later turn you're going to use Sunforger to cast Teferi's Protection. Then, with Teferi's Protection on the stack, you're going to hold priority, activate Quintorius so you're allowed to cast Thieves Auction until the end of turn. Then, once the Teferi's Protection resolves, you're then going to cast Thieves Auction for free, which then makes everyone else have all of their permanents get exiled, but not yours. So when you start drafting all the cards that were exiled, you get to choose the best card first. So starting with you then get to draft the best card, and then everybody else has to start drafting. While they don't have access to necessarily building a full board again, you have a full board plus the best permanents that you can get out of the draft. And ultimately, that's pretty funny, right? But if your play group gets kind of upset with that taking forever to do, you can always swap Thieves Auction out for a card like Worldfire. But that would easily put you into a Bracket 4 deck category if that's not necessarily what you want to do. Now personally, the second combo here using Chance for Glory, I took it out because I felt it was a little too over-centralizing, but if you want to be really nasty, you can do an Infinite Turns loop with this type of setup as well. So here's how you do it. First thing you do, use Sunforger to tutor for Chance for Glory. Then, on your end step, Quint will exile it, and then during your extra turn, you're going to activate Sunforger to go grab Angel's Grace, which gives you the ability to not lose until the end of the turn. And then, you're going to use Quintorius to cast Chance for Glory again. And then, that goes on the bottom of your library, ready to go again for the next turn. And on your end step, Quintorius will exile the Angel's Grace, and then that allows you to repeat, switching back and forth which cards in the library and which cards with Quintorius, allowing you to effectively take infinite turns. And because you're always putting something back in the library, you really can't take infinite turns. So you can amass every single permanent you need in play, have every card that you want to be able to cast, and really just be able to knock down anything anybody's doing. So it is essentially a way to win the game if nobody can interact with any of this. For our final combo, we'll talk about Delayed Blast Fireball. So the first thing, use Sunforger to grab Delayed Blast Fireball out of your library. That'll deal 2 damage to each of your opponents and each creature they control. Then, Quintorius will exile it on your end step, and then you can immediately cast it, activating Quint to do so, and you can cast it from exile, dealing 5 damage to each of your opponents and their creatures. So you've now dealt 7 total damage for about 8 mana or so, which is kind of okay, pretty efficient. But it's the fact that we can repeat this every single turn, because the Delayed Blast Fireball gets put on the bottom of your library, it's ready to go next turn. And if you really had to, you could activate Sunforger again if you had the mana, to cast the Delayed Blast Fireball again during the same turn to get 9 damage in a turn, really letting you kind of push like what can be kept on the board in the first place. So now that you kind of see what the potential is for Quintorius and Sunforger, let's break down how the deck actually operates. We have 3 main stages for this deck. First, we're going to build a value engine to get our cool things to be able to cheat into play. Then we're going to use Sunforger to clear out any sort of potential roadblocks and our answers for any of the threats that currently are in play. And then finally, once we've kind of, taken everybody's wind out of their sails, we're going to unleash our giant spells at a low price with the ability to still have some mana up for interaction to keep them around in play. So the first thing we want to talk about is how Boros generates value in Commander. Now, there's a fantastic article by Kirsten Gregory over on Card Kingdom called The Boros Advantage in Ramp Engine. I'd highly recommend reading that for further reading, but we'll talk about kind of a simplistic view of this. Hers is more focused on building it for more of a mid-range deck that's more creature focused. We don't really have a whole lot of creatures because we have 25 instances in the deck, so there's not really a whole lot of space for creatures to do that kind of engine there, so we'll talk about how we kind of do that differently here. For the basics of how we generate value, we need to look at what our cheap card draw effects are for in our colors. In red and white, we don't really just draw cards just by themselves. It's kind of hard. So for white, we either have to give our opponents cards with things like Cut a Deal or Lauren at the third path, or we have to set some sort of trap and wait for our opponents to trip the trap and then give us cards. So that's stuff like Esper Sentinel or Trouble in Pairs. And these are not bad cards by any means, but I think that there are better options that we could do that support our endgame of trying to put stuff into our graveyard and then cheat things back into play with Quint, and they can be a lot more effective. And when we look at what cheap options we have in red, a lot of the red cards are going to require us to first discard cards to draw cards, or draw cards and then discard cards. So effectively, we end up at about the same number of cards as we had before, but we've thrown cards in the graveyard and hopefully drawn better cards. The basic idea is that we want to use the cards that we discard using these red effects to then reanimate them using either Quintorius or one of the other effects that we have in the library to not necessarily feel the negative impact of needing to discard cards in the first place. So let's say it wasn't a Plains that I discarded, but I instead discarded Cauldron Complete. Sun Titan couldn't pull it out of my graveyard, but I have some other cards that cost considerably less than a Cauldron Complete that I could cast on a later turn to still be able to get it back. That'd be stuff like Duretti Scrap Savant or Forge Anew. Now, for a lot less than spending 7 mana, at least all at once, I can still get the benefits of a Cauldron Complete. And that's kind of the basics of our initial game plan here. We're going to discard stuff, we're going to bring it back, and still get the value of being able to, keep moving through cards in our library. For our big game plan, we're going to talk about how Sunforger works in our Sunforger package. If you aren't familiar with how to build a Sunforger package or what you should consider for your own Sunforger-based deck, I'd recommend watching the Tolarian Community College's video on Sunforger. Fantastic resource. It also came out in that interim between my original trying to build this deck and where we are now, so it definitely helped me figure out some of the cards I needed at the base for this deck. First thing we need to address is how do we even get Sunforger in hand in the first place, right? We have 8 cards that can tutor for it, and their varied flexibilities allow us to grab other cards out of our library for our win cons once we've already got Sunforger in play, so they're not dead once we have Sunforger. Stoneforge Mystic and Goblin Engineer allow us to tutor for Sunforger and also cheat it into play without casting it, which is great for getting around counter spells. Fighter class also lets us reduce the equip cost, and if we really need to, we can use the 3rd level to help have our creatures act as removal. And then Gamble and Reckless Handling also offer us the ability to tutor for an artifact, and then it goes to the graveyard, which we can then cheat back into play, which is also great. So for the first group of support cards that we have ones that help us cheat equip costs, because it's a lot of mana to keep spending to just keep attaching Sunforger over and over again, so we want to get around that. And we have cards like Brass Glider, Fighter Class, Forge Anew, Pure Steel Paladin, Zerta the Dawnwaker, and Fervent Champion that help us get around those costs. And then while we're talking about it, Forge Anew, absolutely insane. It can return Sunforger to play, let you equip it for free, and it also lets you equip it at instant speed as long as it's your turn. So if somebody tries to mess with you attaching Sunforger, you just pay the mana then, and then you reattach it for free, and you're still good to go because you can then detach it, suitor up whatever you need to stop somebody from screwing with you in the first place, and then it still gets reattached because of the original equip that was on the stack. Then for the other cards we want in our support package, we need cards that also help us get Sunforger back should it happen to be destroyed. So Forge Anew happens to also do this, Savine's Reclamation can do this, Duretti Scrap Savant can bring it back, Nahiri the Unforgiving can make a token copy of it, and then you'll have to find a way to keep it from getting exiled afterwards, and then Sun Titan can bring it back as well. For the Sunforger suite of cards that I can actually pull out of the deck, I have 25 of those in the deck, and as you can see they're in a lot of different categories with a lot of different effects. But rather than kind of going over all of them and how they're important for each category, which can also get a little bit more fuzzy when you see that cards can have multiple different groups that they fall in, like Reverberate being able to copy anything that's in our Sunforger suite, essentially acting as a copy of any one of these cards. I'd rather just go over some highlights and some stats about the package itself and talk about some cool interactions of what's in there. No. The last card I want to talk about is Cosmic Intervention. So this card is a 4-mana instant that if a permanent we put into your graveyard this turn from the battlefield, instead you exile it and then return it to play at the beginning of the next end step. It also offers some flexibility because it has a Foretell, which means you can pay 2 mana to put it face down, and then on a later turn spend 1 and a white to cast it, so you can split that cost over 2 turns if it's in your hand. But ultimately, the best reason for this card is that it allows you to do some insane ramp in white, and we'll talk through how we do that. So the first thing is, use Sunforger or cast Cosmic Intervention somehow, then sacrifice a bunch of your permanents. So that could be stuff like fetch lands, mana rocks like Mind Stone or Commander Sphere, sacrifice cards like Roadside Reliquary to draw cards, or Bitter Reunion to give your guys haste. Or you could even sacrifice things to cards like Demand Answers or Goblin Engineer to switch what cards you have in your graveyard and what's in play, and draw some cards as well with Demand Answers. Then, when you get to your end step, all the things that you've sacrificed that turn are going to come back. You want to hold priority because you still have that replacement effect until the end of your turn, not just the end step, and then sacrifice them a second time. So you can sacrifice your Arid Mesa to go get another Plains or Mountain out of your library, and then because the replacement effect is still there, it'll go back to exile for it to return again on the next end step. And then you could crack it for a third time. So think of all that value you just generated here. Your fetch lands fetch for 3. Roadside Reliquary, if you have both conditions met, it can draw you 6 cards. Commander Sphere could draw you 3 cards, right? It's pretty insane the amount of stuff you can do with this card. So now that we've used like our Boros engines to get us to a state where we can have Sunforger in play, and then use Sunforger to answer all of our opponent's stuff, and we've gotten the board to a state that we think we can manage, our end goal is we're going to use Quintorius to kind of reanimate some big spells. And we'll have the mana up to be able to interact with it. I don't really have any sort of like extra reading assignment for this part, but I do have a fun little interaction here. So Esper Sentinel with Sunforger will bring his power up to 5, and then with 5 power, anytime somebody casts a non-creature spell, they got to spend 5 mana to not let you have a draw card. So essentially, if you do this, it's your own version of Mystic Remora. Pretty cool, right? We've only packed about 4 large spells into our deck that can help us close things out, but with the amount of tutoring and recursion we have, it really shouldn't be an issue to find them and then keep them in play. The first one is Parhelion 2. This Pioneer All-Star is a vehicle that creates an army of 2/2 flying angels when it attacks, and it effectively swings for 13 damage. It also is able to play defense due to the fact that they all have vigilance, and the angels are able to crew the Parhelion, so on later turns it can kind of keep itself going as a self-sustaining engine of pain. The newly printed Valor's flagship offers a similarly large flying beater to Parhelion, but it just doesn't come with an army of angels. And in exchange of vigilance, it has lifelink. It also has the ability to cycle itself, so if we have a lot of excess mana lying around, we can create an army of 1/1 pilots, and those pilots can either be used for jump blockers, or they can crew the flagship in the first place. So Cauldron Complete is an indestructible equipment that gives +5/+5, first strike, trample, indestructible, and haste, and on top of all of that, any creatures that it deals combat damage to will be exiled. But for 7 mana to equip the thing, it's kind of a hefty price. Thankfully, it has Living Weapon, which allows us to cheat that the first time at least. When it comes into play, it makes a 0/0 Phyrexian Germ that attaches itself automatically. So once it's in play, you're going to be probably getting through to people because they're not going to want to block with their actual creatures. They're going to get exiled and just gone forever, and it will wear people down over time. If you attach it to Quint, you have a very good powerful source of commander damage here, and it's even better as a blocker because Quint has vigilance, and then the first strike and the exiling clause make him absolutely destructive on defense. And if you attach Sunforger to whatever Cauldron is attached to, then the creature is indestructible, so it's already harder to mess with it. They can't remove the creature that in response to you trying to attach it. And your Cauldron Complete is now a 9/5 trample with all the other stuff here, so it's probably going to get through to most board states here. Our last big splashy card is Rise of the Eldrazi. This 12 mana sorcery can't be countered, destroys a permanent, draws you 4 cards, and gives you an extra turn. It just exiles itself afterwards. So outside of using like Pull from Eternity or Reverberate, you're not really going to be able to loop this thing, but the amount of value it generates is insane, and it's pretty cool. talking about the different ways that we have to find cards, or find these win cons once we've cast them, we've got Stoneforge, Fighter Class, Forging the Tyrite Sword, and Kellen can all grab Cauldron Complete once we already have Sunforger in play, so they're useful on both of those fields. Stoneforge can even cheat it into play for just 2 mana. For grabbing Parhelion 2 or Valor's Flagship and Cauldron as well, you can use Goblin Engineer, Reckless Handling, Enlightened Tutor, or Gamble to grab those. And you can use Gamble really to find anything here in the deck, as long as you're willing to gamble that it won't get discarded afterwards. But with the amount of recursion we have, some might even call the fact that it gets discarded a bonus, because you can get around some counter spells. We have 36 lands in the deck, 12 of them are basics, split evenly between plains and mountains. 7 of them are fetches, 5 are utility lands, and 12 are duels, and then we have 8 pieces of ramp. So, talking about the fetch lands, I happen to have gotten a bunch of the off-color ones in some trades recently, so I thought I'd just throw those in. Prior to that, I only had Arid Mesa, Prismatic Vista, and Fabled Passage for fetch lands. Honestly, it's a little overkill for most intents and purposes, but if you're gonna prioritize putting money, I would probably not put that into these types of lands. It does let you use Cosmic Intervention to ramp a lot more crazily, so we'll talk about some budget-friendly options so you can still do the same more reasonably. So, for some budget alternatives, you've got cards like Promising Veins, Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic, Naya Panorama, the Shire Terrace, Escape Tunnel, and Cabaretti Courtyard. These all fulfill the same basic idea of just being a land that you can sacrifice to go search for another land and put it into play. The only downside is that they all come in tapped, but you can get the collection of these for less than $2. But if you were going to run these, I would probably run more basic lands, because if you keep recurring these lands over and over again, they can't grab your dual lands, so you're going to want more basic lands to pull out of the library with these. As for the utility lands, I only have 5. Legion Leadership is a Sunforgerable cantrip that just happens to be a land on the back, so we're going to treat it as a land, and then it has the ability to be Sunforgered if we needed it. Emergent Zone allows us to get around timing restrictions with Quint, so we can cast stuff like Rise of the Eldrazi the moment we exile it for just an extra, effectively 2 mana, because you got to pay 1 and tap the Emergent Zone. Cryptic Caves, Roadside Reliquary, fantastic lands that can be sacrificed to draw a card, and then if you're doing stuff like casting Cosmic Intervention, you can draw multiple cards using these lands. And then Mistveiled Plains comes in tapped, but it can be tutored for with either Tithe or a fetch land, since it is a typed land here. But its main utility is that when it's in play, we can activate it to put stuff in our graveyard on the bottom of our library, kind of fulfilling the same role that Quint offers for our Sunforgerable cards. For our dual lands, I really just wanted to highlight the duels that were worth more than like $3, because most of the Boros dual lands are pretty cheap. Sacred Foundry and Elegant Parlor are the most expensive ones out of the group, but also the ones I'd prioritize spending money on if you don't want to proxy stuff. Primarily since they're typed dual lands that either, in Sacred Foundry's case, come in untapped, or Elegant Parlor, they enter tapped but they surveil, which can put stuff into the graveyard for us. Jeweled Lotus is a little bit more of a beam. You can play it before casting something like Brought Back or Cosmic Intervention to essentially offset the land loss. But it's incredibly risky, since you can be stopped by a counterspell on the Cosmic Intervention. So if you don't really want to take that risk, you should probably switch it for one of the budget options we'll discuss later. Spectator Seating, Sunbaked Canyon, Sundown Pass, and the Pathways are nice, so they come in untapped, but not necessarily the highest priority. You're already kind of playing a slow deck. It is nice to have that mana available untapped. But for some budget alternatives, we'll talk about these options. So for some budget alternatives, you've got Alpine Meadow and Sacred Peaks. These ones are typed duels. I would highly recommend using these if you don't have the regular type duels, or if you are going to not run some of the untapped dual lands. Rustveil Bridge is an artifact, and it's indestructible, so it's quite nice to have for being able to use for things like Goblin Engineer. You can also tutor for it, and you can sacrifice Rustveil Bridge to bring back like Sunforger or something like that. Abraded Bluffs, Temple of Triumph, and Windscarred Crag do something minor when they enter, either damage or gaining a life or scrying one, but they're still nice. And then Lorehold Campus enters tapped, but it's a little bit of a flavor one because Quintorius is from the plane of Arcavios, but you can also use it to spend 4 mana and scry one if you've got a lot of excess mana hanging around on the later turns there. The red package is a pretty standard array of mana rocks, but some of the cooler ones are like Mind Stone, Commander Sphere, and Forging the Tyrite Sword can be sacrificed and then be used with something like Brought Back to be able to be used multiple times. Smothering Tithe and Jessica's Will are game changers, but if you want to swap them out, I have a couple of budget options that we'll talk about in a second here. For some options on other ways that you could take the deck, I'm going to be trying Mandate a Piece myself. I ordered a copy and I've been waiting for it to show up. Once it gets here, I'll try it out. Because I've been seeing that I've been having a lot of issues with Glorious End just being used as a fog. And I'd really like to not have to limit myself to just to use Angel's Grace every time I use Glorious End. So that's a good option for that. Come Weapons is a good alternate combat trick for Deflecting Palm, but my biggest issue with it over Deflecting Palm is that it costs 4 mana to cast it, so if it's in my hand and I need it, it's a lot more of an ask to use it than it is to use Deflecting Palm, just because you are playing a pretty mana-hungry deck in colors that it's still hard to generate a lot of mana with most of the time. If you want to move to more of a focused deck around casting stuff out of exile, the Planeswalker version of Quintorius, Wild Magic Sorcerer, and Nafilshi, are all great cards that play around with this idea. Quintorius deals damage, Wild Magic Sorcerer gives you Cascade, and then Nafilshi gives you the ability to copy the cards that you're casting from exile. Quintorius, the original Quintorius from Strixhaven, gives you another way to generate more spirits if you want to go down the route of pulling things out of your graveyard and then making a bunch of spirits, which when I originally built this deck, it did do that a lot and it was able to put the beat down pretty quickly, but that wasn't what I was trying to do, but a very fun way to play this deck. Similar idea, if you're going to be making a lot of spirits and you find yourself frequently with too many cards to cast a Quint but not enough activations available, because you can, if for whatever reason you're trying to activate Quint multiple times, you've got things like Prop Room, Drum Bellower, Sting, and White Plume Adventurer to help you keep untapping all your creatures every turn. Leona Shikari allows you to re-equip Sunforger at an instant speed. Very powerful. I haven't found a slot that I'm willing to give up for it yet. And Invoke Calamity lets you catch people off guard. If Quint's not out, because they think that, oh, you can't be casting anything out of your graveyard, you're safe, like that you've already spent your Tybalt's Trickery or whatever to stop something. But this 5 mana card lets you cast 2 cards with combined mana 6 or less from your graveyard in your hand. So typically when you cast this, you're going to get 2 cards out of it, because most of the cards that we Sunforger for are like mana value 3 or less. But my biggest issue with this card is just simply that I just can't Sunforger for it in the first place, because it's mana value 5. If it was a mana value 4 card, I would for sure run this every single time. But yeah, pretty cool card. For my final thoughts, I think this deck falls into the upper end of what you'd expect out of a Bracket 3 deck, or maybe even the lower end of a Bracket 4 deck. Like, it's got game changers, it's got a lot of tutoring, and with the right setup it can even sometimes chain extra turn spells, but it's just not very fast while it does this. The Boros value engine needs a lot of moving parts to get set up, and while it's amassing that value, any sort of aggressive deck is going to completely outpace what you're trying to do with Sunforger to outpace any of that. You could speed this deck up to play better with the 4s with some better mana like Ancient Tomb and Mana Vault, but at that point you're probably not going to want to focus on the large spell reanimation and focus on just doing stuff with Chance for Glory to take infinite turns. But overall, I'm very happy with this deck, and I think it best highlights how Boros can deliver on a control game plan that also offers some cool setups where you can drop Paralion 2 into play and then start beating face as well. So thank you for making it to the end of this presentation, and if you enjoyed what was discussed here, let me know. If there's anything that you want to see me dive deeper into, I could do that. And I have some other decks that we could go over too, if that's something that interests people as well. For some potential future topics, if this video does well, I have some other decks I could talk about. I've got my Koram the Undertaker deck, which is all about randomly stealing stuff out of people's graveyards, and it's got some minor Tarmogoyf shenanigans in there. We've got General Ferris Rockrick. It's my my favorite Boros aggro deck that doesn't really need to commit its entire hand to the board on account of everything being something that generates a 4/4 golem, so you're pretty aggressive, but you don't have to fully play everything out. And then I've got my Zara Renegade Recruiter deck, which is a red-blue deck that's not focused around doing a bunch of storm shenanigans and is focused on theft and clones. So, yeah.